Today we are honored to have Gretchen Bischoff, who is being a flight attendant, part of a cabin crew for a major U.S. airline for almost 3 decades. She's going to talk to us about how the world of aviation, especially cabin crew, has changed over those 3 decades, as well as touch on people's expectation, passengers' behavior, and a little bit about her own family and her career growth. Gretchen, welcome to the program. I believe you're joining us from somewhere in Europe. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm joining you from Dublin, Ireland today.
So, Gretchen, we wanted to start with since you do have nearly 3 decades in the job as flight attendant, that it wasn't long before your time starting at an airline that the dynamics of that job were really different in the decades past, with just strictly women being hired. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like just before your time and in your early years in the job?
Yeah, sure. I started in late of 1998. And to preface this, my sister is also a flight attendant for the airline I work for, and she had been flying for about 12 years longer than me. So she kind of has a different mentality of what it was when I came into training. And I remember when I was invited for an interview, she said to me, if they don't hire you on the spot, it's because you're too fat. And she was still of that mindset that there were weight restrictions. And it wasn't, I don't know how many years prior to me being hired, but there still were weight restrictions for flight attendants and height restrictions.
Wow.
And I remember her saying when she went through training 12 years before me, she would starve herself because they had weigh-ins during their training. So they would starve themselves throughout the week because they knew that they would be sent home if they had gotten above that weight threshold. And I don't remember what that was. It must have been, in correlation with your height or whatever. But also, I do know that when I went down for my interview, one of the thing was there was a height restriction. And you had to be tall enough to reach back into an overhead bin to grab a fire extinguisher out of there, which I don't really know how I did that because I find it hard to close overhead bins sometimes. So I don't think they have that height restriction requirement anymore, but they did back then. So it was
Wow, that
definitely, yeah.
I totally forgot about that. It's impossible to imagine that world now.
Oh, I can't even imagine it being like that now. They couldn't do that now, but there are still flight attendants, I think, around who think, hey, we should have some more restrictions because we hire pretty much anybody these days as long as they have a personality, I think.
Was that change gradual? Was there a particular time when suddenly things shifted to where they weren't looking at height and weight? And I believe you would also mention in the past that you had to be single at a certain time. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about those shifts?
Yeah, I don't know exactly when those weight requirements disappeared, and I would imagine it had to do probably not necessarily that the airlines made that decision, but it was probably maybe a governmental regulation. Although I don't know if that's positive of that or not. But regarding being married, I think that ended maybe in the late '60s, maybe as early as maybe 1970. I'm not really sure, but I fly with so many flight attendants who've been around for many, many years, and they say there was a time when we could not be married. And I've heard stories, I don't know if there's truth to this, but that some women secretly got pregnant, they became pregnant, and they never told the airlines that they were pregnant or married so that they didn't have to leave. So they went and had these babies in secret. They took a leave of absence for some reason, a medical reason or something, and then came back when they were able to come back, and they no longer had an infant at home, but they never told the company that they had children. And also
Wow.
they did have to be single, and they hid marriages and everything. I've heard. I mean, that was long gone, I think, by the time I started, but it's crazy to think that was the part of it.
I remember those days, but now it is very difficult to imagine something like that happening. But societal view of things change. What about you? Also started, if I'm not mistaken, just pre 9/11, a few years before pre 9/11. So what was that change like?
Yeah, things really changed after 9/11, and I think sometimes I say, well, if I look back on my career as a flight attendant, I'm going to say, my gosh, I worked in the most tumultuous times of the airline industry. But 9/11, of course, was a huge impact for so many of us. I was flying during that time. I got stranded in Chicago, but there weren't TVs in the airport at that time. And so, of course, we didn't really know what had happened because it wasn't like there's TVs all over the place. And I think the whole dynamics of flying changed after that. And of course, it's always fun and it's still fun, but your whole mentality and the way you look at flying changed after 9/11. We become more vigilant. I think, look at passengers differently. Of course, our service is different. And it's good and bad, I guess. Times are definitely different than they were.
Flying passengers will usually point to the security measures before they get on board an airliner as some of the biggest changes they've seen since 9/11. But from the cabin crew side, did the workload change besides just your point of view of things? Did you have to end up doing a lot of extra things? I understand that cockpits were made more secure. Did that make the job harder in any way?
Yeah, I think it definitely made the job harder. And for one, I think because we've always been vigilant, but now after 9/11, we really had this in the back of our mind always. So I think in general, the stress level made the job harder because you were kind of always now eyeballing every passenger as they got on the airplane and making sure you knew, oh, I can use him as an able-bodied assistant if I need, or he's going to be my go-to if I need help. And I don't think we really ever did that before, but it definitely made us look at passengers differently. But as far as the cabin service workload, that changed as well because prior to 9/11, we served meals on a hour and a half flight from Newark Airport to Chicago. We served in a full airplane a tray hot meal along with a beverage service in an hour and a half. And I sometimes look back and say, if we ever had to do that again, flight attendants would quit left and right because I don't know how we could do it. I don't know how we did it then, but we seemed to get it done.
Yeah, I think before you reach 10,000 feet, you're already out there with the beverage cars.
Well, that's what it was back then. In fact, when I first started flying, the rule was you had to be up doing the service at 12 minutes after we got above 10,000 feet or something to that respect. I can't remember it now, but we were up right away. Now sometimes it's not like that, but
I want to follow up on Elaine's question. So, as passengers, we know what kind of security measures that we go through to get in the airport. I know that that has also evolved recently, but not taking water, having to remove shoes and all those things. Is that similar for you as a cabin crew, or is that different?
it is similar in some respects. There are certain airports that our requirements are very strict. For instance, in London, passengers they go through regular security and they're allowed to bring liquids. But as crew members in London, we are not allowed to bring full size liquids. We still have to be compliant in the quart size bag, and it's very, very strict. But stateside, we have something called known crew member, and it's that crew members are vetted to be able to go through a separate security line. We are subject to random screening sometimes, and sometimes you might get it 10 times in a row. Sometimes might not get it for 3 months in a row. But we can use that if we're traveling for work or domestically on our own, but not if we're traveling internationally on our own. For work, it's fine to go through that known crew member, but not if you're traveling personally internationally.
So that's like a TSA pre kind of a thing.
Kind of. You may see it sometimes when it's usually to the left or the right of your normal security crew line or your security line for passengers. And it's just a separate area so that we don't have to go through the body scanners and whatnot.
So really, after 9/11, those changes were worldwide in terms of the extra security measures.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, and unfortunately, I think, some of these, while it's in some cases it's lenient for us and we can go through that known crew member. I mean, obviously we can't bring things we're not allowed to, but I foresee that going away someday because unfortunately there's crew members who have broken the rules and screwed those things up for us. So we see more and more random checks and random searches. And I sometimes wonder if that will go away and we'll have to start going through regular security again.
What about technology? I would assume that 30 years ago, everything, I remember paper tickets with carbon copies and stuff like that. Um, I'm old. But technology has changed. Have you seen that from your perspective?
Yeah, definitely. I've seen it. And I think I was talking to my sister about this the other day. Remember, there were no TVs in terminals. And technology, I think, has been good and bad. Prior to there being TVs in seat back pockets and TVs all throughout the terminal, people came on the airplane with books and magazines and they talked to their seatmate. That doesn't happen anymore. People don't talk to strangers on the airplane. I mean, they do sometimes, but everyone gets on the plane and has their phone or their Kindle or their laptop right in front of them or the TV screen, and people are plugging their children into their devices the minute they sit down on the airplane. So in that respect, I hate technology, but it does make our job easier in some respects because we get little dings when we know there's going to be a delay or a passenger's running late. At my airline, we can communicate directly through a Teams app, and the agents can send a little shout out to us saying, I have Mr. So-and-so coming down. He has a bag. Can you find a space for him at the very last minute? So that kind of helps. But then the passengers also have these tools in that they know how long the taxi time should be. There's apps that they can see the airplane kind of moving around, and they say the app says, oh, your taxi time is going to be 12 minutes. Well, 17 minutes goes by, and they're like, why are we still taxiing? And they know that the weather's perfect where we are and perfect where they're going. And they say, but why is the captain saying there's a weather delay? But they don't take into consideration there's a storm in the middle of the country that we have to loop around. So in that respect, I don't like the technology because passengers tend to know things before we know them sometimes, and we're trying to play catch up.
We did an episode exactly on that, and we talked about that of weather delay somewhere else, keeping you on the ground stop at some
Yep.
places. And sometimes the captain comes and announces, sometimes they don't, and leaving the passengers guessing a little bit.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
You talked about the personal interaction changing, and we can all remember in the recent years with COVID. Can you talk a little bit about how the job immediately changed when that happened around the world, and what happened in the preceding years during what we now call the COVID period?
Yeah, COVID was hard. I actually even think COVID might have been harder than 9/11. And fortunately, I was able to take 7 months off in the height of COVID. So I did not have to work through the brunt of it. But even when I came back to work, it was hard. It was stressful. There were people who would wear their masks, people who would not wear their masks, and we know we all had to wear masks. And it became difficult. There were flight attendants who could be aggressive about passengers who, nobody wore the mask right. And so my technique was when I saw someone not wearing their mask, I said, you got to put your mask on. It was all in the approach, but then there were other crew members who could be a little bit more aggressive about it. So that started some conflict at times. And I thank goodness the masks have gone away, but it definitely made things harder and more stressful. Someone would sneeze on the airplane and all panic would ensue because passengers were afraid. Nobody wants to get sick. And we know in general, you get sick when you travel.
We're going to get more into in segment 2 about this whole passenger behavior and how that has changed. But for now, I'm kind of curious. And when you get into the airplane, do you know the other flight attendants and the pilots, or are you seeing them for the first time, somewhere in between?
Often it's for the first time. I have made many friends starting out the day as a complete stranger And 8 hours later, by the time I've gotten to wherever I've gone to, this person is going to be a lifelong friend of mine. And but there's also pilots that I fly with often, but for the life of me, I can't remember their names because we are getting all on the airplane. It's a rush, 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 trying to get things ready. And the captain comes down and says, "Hi, I'm Joe." And you say, "Hi, I'm Gretchen." And, 5 hours later, when I get to wherever I'm going, I'm like, what was his name? I can't remember his name. But it's a crazy job in that you come to work as complete strangers, but you leave as very good friends.
I did not realize that you fly with different people every time. So, I mean, I'm likening it to like a group of referees in an NFL game or a basketball game. They tend to work together. I thought that's how it is. So,
No, it
that's not
used
the case.
no, it used to be like that. When I originally started, we would get our schedule in like a block of time, and you kind of knew every person you would be flying with the same people all month long. And at that time, we also did something called co-pairing. So we were with pilots as well. So say I was going on a 3-day trip, I would be with the same pilots and flight attendants for the duration of that trip. But it's not really like that, especially domestically now. You'll stay with the same flight attendants for 3 days, but the pilots may change every single leg. And we do know when we get our schedules who our crew will be for the month, but it changes every flight. The job is so flexible, and you can pick up trips, drop trips, trade trips, and move all around. So you're constantly meeting new people. And we're also hiring new people. So we get a lot of new people that you've never seen before, also.
That sounds a lot like the pilot side, where you'll be flying with people you've never met before, or possibly fly with them you occasionally, depending on where you're domiciled. And it sounds very much the same. I'm also wondering if the change in that is just due to the size, the increase in air travel, if a lot of those have just changed the way the hiring cycles, if that is at all reflective of what you see on the other airlines with hiring crews due to economic ups and downs. Is it the same way with the flight attendant's job? Are they hiring, not hiring in phases as time goes on?
They went through a few years up until 9/11 where they were hiring tons of new flight attendants. Every week we were getting a lot. And then we went after 9/11 for many, many years without hiring flight attendants and pilots. I think we furloughed many people. We had flight attendants at my airline who were furloughed for 12 years.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, and then they came back after 12 years. It's crazy. But yeah, we go through these stints depending on what the economy is like and how the airlines are doing. And of course, now we're seeing lots of new pilots because pilots have to retire, as you know, at 65, I think it is. And we're getting so many pilots. Sometimes I'm thinking, what is that guy 15 years old? Because he's so young. But we are seeing new pilots almost every trip. It's crazy.
So there's not like a retirement age that's either required or anything like that as part of a cabin crew. Then it sounds like that.
Yeah, there's definitely not a retirement age for flight attendants. I mean, I know some flight attendants who are in their 80s. I do not want to be at this job when I'm 80, and I jokingly say to my friends, if I am here when I am 80 years old, push me out the door. But the greatest thing about this job is that it's so flexible, and you can work basically as little or as much as you want. So I do say to myself, although I would like to retire at 65, 67, if I still felt good at 70 and I still love the job like I love it now, and I could still do the job, I would probably stick around and fly those primo trips, one Rome trip a month and one Venice trip a month, or, just get those fun little layovers in and then be done with it.
We're going to get into more of all your fancy destinations and your favorite things and maybe not so favorite things later on. But I would love to invite the people who are watching and listening, if they have questions about this, maybe if you don't have an instant answer, we'll find an answer and then respond to it. Gretchen, you mentioned earlier about passengers just having apps and technology, so they track things that maybe you don't even know yet. So I'm kind of curious, how has the passenger attitude changed, especially over the last 2 decades, 3 decades? And how do you deal with that as a flight attendant?
I don't really know how I deal with it sometimes, but I think it all has to do with your attitude. I think I'm an optimist for the most part, and I try, even if I get a silly question like, well, do you know where my bag is? I try to go with it and make a joke about it, but we don't know all the information sometimes that the passengers know. And also, it's a different clientele. Prior to 9/11, it was businessmen. We had the airplanes were filled with businessmen. And I don't know what's happening now. We are all complaining about the economy. However, everybody is flying, and it is not the same passenger that we are used to from back in the day. It's families. Every trip I work, there's a family of 4 or 5 in business class, and I'm thinking, what are these people doing that they can afford this type of travel? But I'm also seeing passengers getting some passengers, and for the most part, they're amazing and so kind and nice. But there are passengers who are very demanding and expect you at their beck and call, um, lifting their bags for them, get me this, ringing their call light a million times. And it can be very frustrating and aggravating. But I think we're in the customer service business, and you have to kind of take the good and the bad and think, all right, this is my job. I can do this. I can get through this. And I take it in a way that I kind of try to joke with passengers and ease things over so that I don't get those. I may have an angry person, but I feel like I can always put that fire out. And maybe that's something special that's only certain flight attendants have, because I don't think everyone has the ability to do that. But it definitely has to do, I think, with your personality and dealing with the difficulties that we do have in flight sometimes.
We've sometimes seen on the news, sometimes really sensational, like a passenger got incredibly out of hand and even had to be restrained. Have you ever had the burden of having to witness anything like that? And what are flight attendants trained to do if somebody does happen to get disruptive?
Yeah, fortunately, I have never had anything like that happen. I've definitely had my share of crazy people on the airplane, but never anything that had gotten to an extreme where police say had to be involved. But we do have training in self defense methods and different ways that we can help out in a situation like that. And we also are really, really keyed into working with your fellow crew members. And if I am having difficulties with a passenger that is, I'm not getting anywhere, I know to diffuse the situation, step away and ask one of my colleagues to say, can you go speak with that passenger in 27B and see if you can do. And so I think a lot of it has to do with knowing when you need to step back and let someone else take over, because we can't all solve every single problem. But fortunately, my airline, and I'm sure most airlines for the most part, give training that allows us to learn to deal with these difficult situations.
We did a episode recently about um, chimes and bells that you hear in airlines all the time. We were kind of curious. Do you have like secret chimes that you use to, let's say, let the other cabin crew know or the pilot know that there is a passenger situation that may get out of control?
I wouldn't say they're secret chimes, but I watched your episode the other day and I was giggling because we hear these series of chimes often, and we know they indicate getting to 10,000 feet. A lot of times it's the passenger call light, or it could be the telephone that the pilots are calling and saying, we need a bathroom break. And if we're on a domestic flight and we only have 2 pilots, that means another flight attendant has to go into the cockpit while one of them has left to use the facilities, and then another flight attendant will be there with a cart across, facing the cabin and guarding the cockpit door. So I wouldn't say there's secret codes, but we all know this chime means that. And there also, I remember you guys were discussing the lights that you see some in through the cabin or in the galley. So those indicate either a telephone call on, I don't know if this is on all airplanes, but on our airplanes, if it's pink, it means it's a call, interphone call between the crew. If it's blue, it's a passenger call light. And if it's amber, it is the bathroom. Someone is in the bathroom who has pressed the thing in the bathroom. We think it indicates that they need help, but really what it really means is that they didn't find the flusher and they're pressing the flight attendant call button instead of the toilet flusher.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious because if you articulated really well that if a particular passenger you cannot handle it, you are getting other people to help. So I just thought maybe there's another way of saying that, hey, need help here in 27B.
We use our big mouths, I think, for the most part. If I really needed help, I would be hollering down the aisle, even maybe relying on a passenger. And like I said, I have never had to deal with anything serious like this. But, if there were a medical emergency and I needed help, I would yell out that I had a problem at a certain area. And if I was far enough on a 777 or a 787, you might be really far away from where another crew member was. And I would probably yell to a passenger, go get a flight attendant, tell them to come to such and such a seat.
It's definitely a team effort, whether there's something normal going on or something abnormal going on. It sounds like all the way up to the cockpit, to the very back of the aircraft, because you traveling internationally are in really large aircraft. You mentioned the 777, 787.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, you can't see from the back of a 777 all the way up to the front of the airplane. So on a bigger airplane, we have like an automated announcement system. So if there were, say, a medical emergency in the back of the plane and we needed a doctor, we could just go, we can get on the PA ourselves and say something, but there's also an automated button that we can press, paging for a doctor or medical assistance. So we definitely have some great tools to help us get through events like that.
Did you notice any marked difference in passenger attitude pre 9/11 and post? Also recently from sort of the COVID years, so to speak.
I think we go through stages in the airline industry, but there have been times after 9/11, passengers were so nice. And I think everyone was on edge flying, but people would get on right away and smile. And, big guys would get on and say, if you need any help, just, I'm in such and such a seat. But there are definitely, probably throughout all of my years in this career, but I think now, and I think it's just an indication of what our society has turned into, that passengers are not always kind. I know crew are not always kind either, but I think for the most part we are. And if we seem unkind, it's just maybe because there's stress. And that's part of the problem. We don't know what's going on in everyone's lives. Travel is stressful, and we see these situations, and you just have to hope that you can smooth things out. I mean, not everyone enjoys flying, but we can make that better for them.
That's probably never changed. You've probably seen that there are always nervous flyers, if you could touch on that. Is there anything that cabin crew are trained to do to deal with either nervous flyers? I know some people who get a little bit ill when they're on an airline, and they may be stressed out, especially if there's like turbulence, which we're encountering just about every flight or at some phase of that. Can you talk about that side of it a little bit?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of nervous flyers out there, and you can see them as they're boarding. You can see the stress in their face. I feel like I can pick out who's a nervous flyer. Even people get on the airplane crying because they're so nervous.
Oh, wow.
But one thing, if they feel that if they feel like they can ask me a question, or I've noticed that they're nervous, I say to them, listen, if you don't see me looking scared, you shouldn't be scared, because I'm in this plane all the time, and I think being in an airplane is safer than driving on the roads. And so just look at what I'm doing. But then I also will ask them, what makes you scared? Is it takeoff? Is it landing? Is it the turbulence? For the most part, I think it's turbulence. I mean, we do see the people with the death grips, on takeoff, especially if you're one of those jump seats right in front of some passengers. And I just kind of smile and say, it's okay. It's going to be fine. But turbulence, even sometimes I don't get nervous with turbulence, but it's hard sometimes. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, what is happening here? But we're seeing more and more turbulence. But if I know someone is very nervous and that's the cause, I try to call the cockpit and say, hey, do you know how long this is going to last for? There are different terminologies for the level of turbulence. And I try to put that in layman's terms for the passenger and say, you know what, it's not going to be any worse than this. And just think you're just on a roller coaster. And the captain said we should be through this in 20 minutes, which we hope is the case. Sometimes we know it's longer, and we just have to go with it.
Sounds like you need to be a psychologist and a counselor.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Yeah, that's great. You talked about turbulence, but what is the worst sort of emergency that you have faced? Have you faced anything major?
No, I really have not. There may have been way back in the day. I think I had a person who was mentally ill, and I remember having to really we just sit him in a seat by himself and kind of calm him. That was before the times when we had devices that we could restrain people if we had to, which thankfully doesn't happen very often. Never in my career has it happened, but I really haven't had anything bad happen. Maybe the worst is I did have clear air turbulence once, flying over the Rockies, and it was scary. But other times things happen and you don't even realize it. I must have been on my international break, and when we got on the ground, the captain said to me or to the crew, hey, everyone, make sure you fill out a report about that severe turbulence. And I was like, severe turbulence? What are you talking about? I must have been sleeping on my break and I didn't even realize it. And we just get so accustomed to the turbulence that we just don't even realize it's so bad.
Well, hope we keep it that way, that you don't go through any emergency in the future. Not. But I'm sorry, I have to ask you, since you just mentioned, you talked about break. So do you have a quarters where you can take rest, and is it comfortable?
Yeah, it's pretty comfortable. On our wide body airplanes, the 777 or the 787, we have crew rest areas. On some of those, it's at the cabin level, and on other airplanes, it's a little room, an area, I wouldn't call it a room, above the cabin seats. Sometimes I walk down the aisle and I think, how does that fit up there? But there's a little stairway that goes up, and then there are bunks up there. And okay, it's not like your bed at home or your bed at your hotel, but it's a good place to get away on a long flight. Say you're flying to Haneda or Sao Paulo, where we, I think there's rules on how many people can be on break. Maybe a third of the crew or quarter of the crew, something like that, can be on the break at one time, and the purser will work these all out. So maybe we get to step away into this area for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and just take a load off your feet. Rest. I usually sleep. Some people go up and watch a movie, read their books, but it's a secret little area that goes up. Most people don't even know where it is.
Probably don't want people to know where it is. I don't think I could figure out where the crew goes during a break on a long international flight. So that might be a trade secret, because people found that would be a problem.
Yeah, they'll knock on it and say, hey, where's my bag?
Yeah. When the flight attendant says to you, that's not a bathroom, that's probably a good indicator, but that's where the crew bunks are.
So for those of you who have flown commercially, have you observed disruptive passengers? Have you actually been in an emergency? Tell us in the comments about your experiences. So Gretchen, I'd like to go back to what appealed to you in terms of a career as a flight attendant. And did you know when you got into that and signed up what it took to get to the job that you have now?
I think I always loved travel. I grew up with my dad, traveled. He was out of the country 2 or 3 weeks of every month, my whole life, basically, working as a combustion engineer with refineries and places like that. So I grew up going to airports. I think I always had this love of airplanes, but I had a great job in the ski industry that I loved and I really enjoyed doing. But my sister had been a flight attendant for 12 years prior to me, and she always said to me, "You should become a flight attendant. You would love it. You would make a great flight attendant." And I said, "I do not want to live out of a suitcase. I don't want to do that." And thank goodness I changed my mind because it was the greatest decision I ever made. And I probably started the job thinking I'll do this for a few years, like every flight attendant says. And then almost 30 years later, here we are. And you can't ever leave because it is the greatest job ever.
Wow.
Is there a transition from a flight attendant job? Is there like a progression? How does that work?
I wouldn't say there's a progression. I mean, there's definitely different things that you can do. We all start out as your basic cabin crew. We are all equals. And I think, everybody on the airplane is equal. However, on our wide body airplanes, we do have a lead flight attendant who is our purser, who, has a little bit more responsibility in that they would be, they have paperwork and they deal with the cockpit and, if we have emergencies, they're kind of like the person. But we all do a thing. You find an emergency, you own it. You're the person who's going to handle that. And so I wouldn't say you can really progress to something, more in the job, except as a cabin crew. But maybe you could find another job within the company if you decided being in the airplane wasn't your thing.
Oh, that's really interesting because I always wondered there are so many jobs within that job that you have to know how to do, not just CPR, emergency response, dealing with evacuation, and then doing the day-to-day things with getting the passengers in and out on a normal day. So does it take a long time? Do you go to a special school that each airline sets up? I think people are curious to just know what kind of training do you get starting out?
Yeah, the training is intense. It really is intense. When I went through training, I think it was 8 weeks, maybe 8.5 weeks. And then I believe I stayed an extra week because the base that I was going to had the DC-10, which they were kind of phasing out, but my base still needed to get qualified on that airplane. Now, they hire you as long as you're a high school graduate. It'd be great if you have some a college education, but you have to be, I believe, at least 18 years old. And now the training is condensed into, I believe it's 6.5 weeks. It is intense. And what I hear from these young people and older people coming through the training program now, you have got to be on top of it. There's testing, there's regulations, there's guidelines, and you're in a huge group with many other people that you've just met, and they start early in the morning and they are going basically 8, 9, 10 hours a day. And you have to come into it knowing, wow, this is going to be some aggressive training, and they will send you home in a heartbeat if you don't pass, one of the steps of the examinations that you have to go through. And you have to be organized, you have to be flexible, you have to be able to say when they tell you we need you here at 5 a.m. in the morning, you have to know, oh, I better be prepared in the morning. And I think maybe in one respect it might be a little bit easier for them in that they have computers to go through it. When I went through training, we didn't have computers. Flight attendants have to know where every piece of emergency equipment is on the airplane. When I went through training, we had little papers with a diagram of the airplane, and we called them pickles. And you had written on there where every single piece of emergency equipment was. Now they can do all that on the computer, but we would spend hours at night trying to make up acronyms for what piece of equipment was in every part of the airplane. So, it's intense, and you have to be willing to be flexible and organized to get through it, for sure.
I had no idea. It sounds like a, pretty much a parallel process to a pilot training. that they have to go through pretty regimented, pretty intense. That's good to hear. We have, as passengers, we don't see that side. So thank you for educating us on this. I have a question. Again, I want to take you back in time. It seems like who is coming into the cabin crew positions has evolved over time. I mean, I don't know if this is statistically correct or not. It seems like mostly women were going into that job and pilots were men, and now that's all changing.
Yeah, I don't know if it's reversing. I mean, I've seen a lot of female pilots these days, but whereas there were pretty much only young, pretty females entering the job back in the day, now it's very gender inclusive and weight inclusive, and men, women of all ages. I see, if you see these TikTok reels, all these flight attendants have these TikToks that they're making, and I'm seeing plenty of people in their mid 50s starting out in this career late in life. Maybe they retired from something else and now they're doing it. And I think people realize, wow, this is a great gig to get into. And honestly, I think the airlines like it that they can hire some older people as well, because they know they're not going to stay in the job as a lifelong career like the majority of us who are still flying are doing. And so, while I would say the majority of the people they're hiring are much younger, men and women, um, of all races and genders, there's a lot of older people getting into the career as well.
That's great. It sounds like the diversity has just increased over time to where we notice as flyers that has also changed over time. So that's great. And the appeal, as you mentioned, that got you into the job is to travel. So can we get into that side of it? That sounds like an amazing way to see the world, to see the country. And it sounds like you definitely get around yourself. I mean, that's amazing. You're in Dublin right now, and people have got to be thinking that is such a cool job to be able to do that.
It is great, but mind you, it took me a long time to get to this. When you start out, you're on call. Now, our new hires are on straight reserve, so being on call for 2 years straight. So basically, they know that they have, I don't know, 10 or 12 days off a month, but they don't know their schedule the rest of the time. And then the days that they're available to the company, they have to be at their base. And then the company could call them at any time, to give them a 2 or 3 hour notice to be at the airport to go somewhere. And while it's always been like that, I think it's a little bit harder for the new hires now. And I didn't always fly these great destinations. When I started flying, I was flying to Tulsa and Oklahoma City. I mean, I can tell you where every great barbecue place is in the country, or that walking along the Riverwalk in San Antonio is great. And those are fantastic layovers, but I feel very lucky that I've reached a point in my career where I can go to India, or I can go to South America, or I can go spend 24 hours sitting on the beach in Miami. And that's the pull for this job, is that you can see the world, and it may take some jostling of your schedule over the years to kind of get to these places, but eventually you get a point in your seniority, because the airline is seniority driven, that you can see these amazing places. And I don't know many flight attendants who would give that up, because we love the flexibility of it. We love that we can get away from our families. I hate to say that, but you know what? Sometimes you need a break from your kids, and but it's hard sometimes, because you miss out on some really great things. And I remember I returned to work when my son was only 3 months old. And I remember crying every time I left. And then my husband said to me, "But Gretchen, you might miss that first word, but it's still going to be the first word for you." And he got in the habit of not telling me, "Oh, he said something today," because then at least it was still fascinating for me when I got home, and I felt like it was the first time that he had said a certain word or took his first steps, whatever it was. So I would say the job is just so wonderful, but it can be the most fulfilling, but also the loneliest of jobs as well.
You talked a little bit about the downsides. Some people do think very hard about taking a job that does take them away from their family. How have you been able to balance that out in your career?
I think I don't know that everyone would agree with me on this, but I feel like I've kind of had the best of both worlds. That fortunately, my husband had a very flexible career, so that he could be home. I never had to put my son in childcare, and I think for me, when I'm home, I'm fully there. You don't bring this job home with you. You don't come home and talk about, the trials and tribulations of the office, because we don't have a so-called office. And so I think I made it work in that I could be flexible enough. I could be home when my husband was traveling, and when I wasn't, my husband was always there to watch my son. But I think in general, it just, in my case, and maybe this isn't the same for everyone, but I feel like it made my son a stronger, more confident kid. He was forced to do things on his own. He was forced to understand that mom couldn't be at every school event, at every go-kart race, at every sporting event. And that was okay, because we managed to get through it. And I think, my family in general is better off because of that. Everyone's kind of, built a little bit more confidence in themselves to do things without mom having to micromanage their lives.
Definitely having that support of your doing that job is a big thing then for anyone who's considering.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah. And it's one thing that I do think, like, if you're getting into this job, you have to have the support of your family or your partner. I don't think my husband always loved this job. He came to love this job. But I see flight attendants sometimes who are constantly having to report back to their husbands. I mean, and I don't think you can do this job if you don't have that person at home who fully trusts you to be out gallivanting around the world and with all these, different people that they don't know. Because my friend group at work is not really my husband's friend group. He knows of my flight attendants that I'm, talk about all the time, but he doesn't know them personally. And I think your partner has to have faith in you that you are still, with it fully engulfed in your marriage, even though you're out visiting the world without them.
Do you bring fancy gifts from different places? Do the family expect that?
I think they've come to expect it. Okay, little joke here is that flight attendants love foreign grocery stores. So our children and spouses know every bougie product from everywhere in the world. And I always have a couple bricks of fancy French butter hidden in the back of my freezer, because I know that someday, often, someone in the family is going to say, when are you going back to Paris? Because we need more butter. So right now my suitcase is filled with a whole bunch of canned fish, like tuna fish and sardines and mackerel from Lisbon. I'm always lugging around this heavy suitcase because I know that there are products from all over the world that everyone wants. And we have a great wine selection from around the world. In fact, funny story, years ago, I was commuting home from New York up to Vermont, and my suitcase was very heavy. I had about 12 bottles of wine in it that I had been collecting over several trips, but I couldn't get the bag into the overhead bin. And I was struggling, and I heard this voice behind me, and this man said, "What do you have in that bag? You need some help?" And I knew it was Bernie Sanders. I knew it was him, and I turned around, and it was Bernie Sanders. And he helped me get my bag in the overhead bin, and he said, "What is in this?" And I said, "Wine." And he said, "Can't you buy wine in Vermont?" And I said, "Not this wine."
What a story.
Yeah, it's a good story. My only encounter with Bernie Sanders. But yeah.
Do you have a favorite place? What are your top 3 favorite places to go?
I think, okay, I've spent the majority of my career I've spent in London. And I love London, for one, because I speak the language. I can get around without a map. I don't need to have my phone in my hand trying to get around. And I mean, I love London. I could spend every layover in London, but I also love New Delhi. I think it was a new, fascinating destination for me. I like those long haul flights. They're very productive in time, so I can work less days. And I think it's an amazing, amazing country, and I like to shop there too. Um, and domestically, I would say I love Miami. I any beach layover I like, but I like Miami and San Antonio. San Antonio is a great city too. So, I mean, there's great cities all over the world, and sometimes it involves what my favorite is like my sister will say to me if we meet up on layovers. Sometimes we're not at the same base, but we try to coordinate our layovers, and our big joke is we know our trip might be 4 weeks away, but she'll say, "Where are we going to go to dinner?" 4 weeks ahead of time, we're planning where we're going to go to dinner because we know where our favorite restaurants are all over the world.
That's amazing that you and your sister actually get to meet somewhere else on the planet while you're at work. That's, I mean, how many jobs can you say that? That's really
Yeah,
great.
it's great. And actually, for a short time, she was based with me in New York, and we got to fly together. And one time we were working to Delhi, I believe, and she usually works in business or first class. And I made her work in the coach cabin with me, and we were on the cart together. And it was funny to see if people realized that we were sisters or not working together. But I'll tell you, I've had some of my greatest layovers with her. I mean, we went into some desert in Doha. I can't remember the name, the Arabian desert, perhaps it is. And we went on these cars through the desert. I mean, we say this, it was the
Wow.
greatest layover ever. Or going to the Taj Mahal together, or just walking around London on Abbey Road. One time we spent a half hour sitting at Abbey Road, the famous Beatles site, watching everyone kind of reenacting the album cover. And I said, it's fun things like that, but I feel so lucky and blessed that I've been able to do that with my sister.
It's just fascinating that you're going through all these experiences and also share with your family. I also hear that there are sacrifices that there's a trade-off. It's not all rosy stuff. It's also
No.
other things that you have to trade off that makes it all real, all the more real. But when I'm in an airplane and you come and make these announcements about safety, flight safety, am I supposed to pay attention to that? Are you actually telling me every plane is actually different?
Yes, please, please, please pay attention. Okay, flight attendants, contrary to what a lot of people believe, are highly trained individuals, and we're smart people. And we have to, the FAA requires us to be able to evacuate a full airplane with a certain amount of exits blocked in just 90 seconds. Some of our airplanes hold over 300 people. That's a lot of people.
90
But
seconds for 300 plus people?
yes, and
Wow.
with
Wow.
I think I can't remember what the figure is, if it's a quarter or maybe even half of the exits being blocked for some reason. Sometimes exits don't work in an evacuation, but I can't stress enough because we've all seen it time and time again with airline incidents, people recording and TikToking on their way out. You can't do that. And please don't bring your bags. You will get your bags. Please do not bring your luggage. They're going to puncture the slide. They're going to hurt someone. And once you get to the door, we're going to rip that bag out of your hands and not let you go with it anyway. Some get through, as we can see. But, every airplane incident is different. Every airplane itself is different types of, doors, how the doors are, the number of doors, the number of crew. And as we saw in the airplane incident in Toronto, I think it was just a few weeks ago, the plane was upside down. And I believe that my company has actually integrated this into our training now, because they do kind of update the training as incidents occur, and said those flight attendants had to evacuate that airplane upside down. So you were evacuating but walking on the ceiling. Now think about that. If there's an evacuation slide, the slide is now falling in the opposite direction. So you got to pay attention. And I often give the dirty glare. I mean, most of the time when I'm working, I'm on an airplane where there's a video monitor. So I can't tell who's watching, but there are times when I have to put the mask on and put the vest on and do the manual safety demonstration. And I do give the evil glare sometimes, like, pay attention, please, because you never know when you're going to need this. I mean, I hope no one ever has to do it, but I hope that they are prepared if they have to.
Well, you convinced me. Next time I'm going to take my AirPods and listen when they're making those announcements.
Yes.
Good tips for people. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gretchen, we appreciate you sharing sort of the good, the bad, the ugly part of it. There are stories and some of these things we just don't get to see, so we appreciate that. I do have a question for you.
Yes.
Do you have an advice for people who are looking for career? Is this a career you would recommend? If so, what would you tell them?
Yeah. I mean, I've had an amazing time in this career and I don't plan on leaving anytime soon. And I would recommend it for someone who is personable, has good customer service skills, someone who is willing to adapt to an ever changing schedule, maybe not knowing what you're going to be doing in the next few days. Because I think the benefits definitely outweigh the bad in this job. It's definitely challenging sometimes, but I think you just, if you are willing, if you want to travel and you want to see the world, if you're willing to be adaptable, friendly, again, like have good customer service skills and be a great team player, you could have a long and very happy career in the aviation industry. I would recommend it for anyone. It's great.
That's really great. And you mentioned the diversity of people now working in that field. So really anyone even considering should take a look, because you can get into this at any age, any background. And it sounds like a lot of fun in terms of when you get to that point where you really do enjoy the travel and you get to know the job and dealing with those challenges that you talked about.
Yeah, I think that's the truth. And if they apply with one airline, I think lots of airlines are. I don't know if they're currently hiring, but you kind of have to check the airline websites and see. And hey, if one airline turns you down, then go to another. We have lots of major airlines and regional airlines who are always looking for new flight attendants. So I think there's always lots of opportunities out there.
Gretchen, we appreciate you taking the time to share your story, telling us about your experiences, and I was really interested in seeing how the world has changed, aviation world has changed over the last almost 30 years. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.